AI with NG. Karibu sana. I can see you. Moment of silence for Baba. I'm just playing Costa Ojuang. So let me set the mood with Costa. This guy is such a gifted musician, huh? I've been listening to this song on repeat, huh? Gingero, tawura dingo, child gingero. Child gingero, tawura dingo, gingero. Karibu, I think I started about 5 minutes in, huh? Yeah. Asante karibu, Giorgio Pondo, Oko, karibu. Leo ni siku ya Baba, so we're doing reflections on his legacy. Karibuni sana. Karibu, karibu. Ah, good to hear. Good to hear. I hope Going Studios is doing good, huh? Yeah. Pass my regards. Moses, karibu sana. We'll start in about 2 minutes. Watch out to India. George, karibu. Karibu sana. Adiambo Odondi. Most welcome. Frederick Teach, good evening, man. Lazima, Lelbi, nitatembea siku moja. I need to give them a book, by the way. Huh? Yeah, I should do. Nyarkano, karibu sana. Ivy, karibu sana. Nice surprise. Yeah. West Game. Karibia, karibia. Good. Yeah, that's Costa Ojuang, man. I discovered that song just, I think it came out just, I think probably the day after Agwambo died. And I've been listening to it over and over and over again. In case you're wondering what the song is, it's Raila Odinga by Costa Ojuang. Check it out, man. It's on YouTube. Should be quite easy to find, huh? Yeah, so guys, man, thank you for joining me for this live. I wasn't able to do one last week for obvious reasons. Baba, it was a Baba moment, you know, so we're all kind of observing a moment of I guess, suppose, there's a deep moment of grief nationally. I think it was a shock for a lot of people. Baba was a kind of character that people didn't quite expect to die. Despite his advanced age, 80 years of age, the guy had boundless energy. So people just didn't really expect him to go so soon and go in the way that he did. Yeah, but the reality is that he's gone. And I just want to kind of reflect on his legacy, my inspiration for writing. If you might have read 2 pieces that I've done that speak to the moment. and then open it up to just kind of conversations from everybody else who can just contribute, give me your reflections. Think of it like kind of like a grief circle. If you're joining me for the first time on this live, typically what happens, it's very kind of loose. So think of it like just guys just hanging out, and yakking. Basically, I do most of the talking, unfortunately, but if you throw in comments, it kind of gives me the kind of impetus to kind of speak towards the issues. So the idea is that we have a kind of exchange, you put stuff in there, and we have a kind of a live interaction. So that's kind of how it works. So I want to start off, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Oyunga Pala. I am a Kenyan writer, in case you're wondering, who's this guy? I'm the author of this book. It's called Strength and Sorrow, Reflections of the Ones We Lost. And I've got an interesting backstory. So, Karibu. Fabian Karibu, George Efsini, Adiambo Karibu. So, you see, this book is interesting. So I wrote this book like about, I've been working on it like for about 3 years. And then it was released on September the 8th. And I was in Nairobi from about the 1st of October, just basically coming to do a book tour, a promotion. Some of you guys we might have met as I did the rounds around the bookshops. I did Nairobi, and then I went over to Kisumu and came back to Nairobi and continued doing the rounds. And I did the rounds until, interesting enough, the 15th. I live in war-torn Europe, so I was really making my way back. And on the day of my flight is when we received the news that Baba has rested. So by the time Baba was landing from India, I was unfortunately away. I was away from home, but nonetheless, I watched the whole spectacle, and grieved alongside with, I guess, thousands and I suppose millions of other people around the world who were grieving that moment. What was quite interesting was this, and this is kind of where I want to start with. And a couple of friends kind of pointed it out at the time. So chapter 2 of this book, and I really want to spoil it for those who haven't bought the book, so here it goes. Chapter 2 of the book, which interestingly enough starts on, I'm flipping to it, which interestingly enough starts on page 13. Just a friend of mine called Brian pointed that out. Chapter 2, I don't know if you can read that. Can you see that? Yeah. It reads, Baba's Gone, which is then basically the title that I use for the series of articles that I've been doing over the last 2 weeks, in reflection of Baba's legacy. And the top of it reads that a cow dies with grass in its mouth, So basically, people dying in their prime. Derek, karibu. People dying in their prime, So a cow dies with grass in its mouth, Death finds us as we're living, as we're busy doing the aspect of living. The first line of this particular chapter begins by, when Baba died, I became numb. He died of a heart attack at 59. He collapsed at home one morning after breakfast as he prepared to drive to his clinic in Luanda. Now, that's kind of crazy, So when I read those lines now and reflected, especially after this Baba that I was writing about was my own father. He died a very long time ago. He died in 1989. So the story basically was a reflection on his passing. Basically now as a grown man looking back at how my first encounter with like a big death, as a teenager, big death in the family. And what is interesting about this chapter is that I try to use this chapter to explain the Luo funeral process. If you've read this chapter, you'll realize that it's exactly what played out with Baba's funeral. The only difference is scale. While my father's funeral was a small, contained funeral, in comparison, of course, to Baba's, which was a spectacle of a huge magnitude, the processes were largely the same, So if you think of processes like how people mourn, the dodges that have been saying, something called the Sigwea, I write about it, the aspect of unruly grief, people just basically, what we like to say, tomirema, in Luo, which means people just letting the ugly emotions spill out, It was all on display the kind of disputes, the posturing that we saw with the politicians, the difference between the solemnity of a ceremony in Nairobi vis-a-vis what happens when a body arrives in the village, And so there are a lot of those comparisons. So if you're ever kind of trying to make a sense of a traditional Luo funeral, or more, actually, let's call it a hybrid Luo funeral, because it's always a mixture between Christianity and traditional rites. This chapter actually gives you a little bit of a glimpse into it. Yeah. Valerie, karibu sana. Nyakwarokelo, I've seen you there. Karibu sana. Valerie, nice to see you. So when I originally write it, so then of course, the first cue I get is this. As I'm promoting this book in Nairobi, just 1 week before Baba dies, one of my friends, a very good friend of mine, who's actually Dutch, tells me that, hey, and she actually knows, she knows Raila Odinga because she's done some work around him and with him. And she looks and says, when I read your chapter 2, the chapter 2 that's titled Baba's Gone, I was triggered, Like what would have happened? It's interesting because it happened literally, she was telling me this literally 4 days before the news came, She was telling me she was very triggered. And then of course, when it happens, it seemed as though, and what was odd for me, let me speak from my perspective of myself as a writer. What was odd for me is that I've been speaking about grief for literally since May, right? I've been thinking about grief for almost 3 years, ever since. And if you read the context of the book, you'll see how long I've been thinking of grief and what the triggers were for me to start writing about grief. So I've been thinking about grief for a very long time. And from about May, I started writing consistently about grief. So if you ever go to my website or go to my Substack, you will see reflections of the ones we lost. And if you follow me on Facebook or Instagram or perhaps Twitter, you'll notice that I have weekly posts that seem to operate in the universe of grief. Now, it seemed a bit strange for a lot of people who kind of know my writings, because I came from a kind of a satirical masculinity, social commentary background. And suddenly I'd kind of just doing a deep dive on one subject over and over and over again. So it was strange what the obsession was. But, sometimes, I don't know, I guess the spirit leads, You have no idea why you're doing certain things. Nonetheless, it seemed as though, and then the serendipity of it is that I plan a book tour that ends on the exact day that Baba passes. Now, I've had a lot of reflections from people who have gotten the book, and they've said how the book has ended up serving as a really beautiful companion in their understanding of grief. So this is really what I want to kind of explore. One, using kind of Baba as the mirror, and then using it to kind of segue into our own personal stories of grief, because you will notice, as we discuss further, that there are a lot of parallels and similarities. So picking up on this, when I originally wrote my chapter, my lamentation on grief, the first time Baba died, which I posted last Thursday, I called it Baba's Gone, Part 1, right? My lamentation. And what I was trying to explain was, of course, that journey, that I'm coming back into Nairobi after a long time. I'm discussing grief. I'm going around places, and they're turning into kind of spontaneous grief circles. So like, for example, I go to a place called Semanami, which is a bookshop in Gara. And Kenyans, we are no us guys on time. So it takes a while for kind of people to come. There's not too much of a big crowd. But at some point, there's like about 5 or 6 of us. And we kind of sit down in a circle, and we just start talking. And people start opening up beautifully, deeply, speaking about, just how they process grief. The same thing happened at the textbook center in Sarit, textbook center in Sarit Center. And people just opening up, speaking about their own process of grief, how they've addressed it, how they deal with it, what they've learned, and those who perhaps have never gone through like big losses, kind of, querying about like, okay, how does one deal with an eventuality that looks like this? So I'm doing all of that. So the story then is explaining the process of the book tour. Then as I come down towards the end of it, I talk about receiving the news that Baba has passed, And I remember calling my cousin, she's called Jillian. And Jillian tells me, bro, cause I don't know what I'm feeling, you know? And in a way, it kind of threw me all the way back to 1989 when my dad died, you know? And I call that shock. You're shocked. You don't know what to feel. You don't know. You don't even break down in tears. It's just kind of a numbness that sets in, which is why then the chapter becomes kind of relevant, you know, because it's a numbness. You don't know what to do. And a lot of people then explained, and when I shared it with my friends, a couple of cousins of mine that I was talking to over this period, most people said, you know, like from about Thursday, they really can't do anything. Friday, people are trying to work. Saturday, everybody's watching TV. Sunday, we're all stuck on TV. It's only on Monday that people started getting a sense of like, whew, okay, something has happened. Now I can try and get on with life. You know, so that was kind of the numbness that had kind of shaken people. The other thing that I found, the other thing that then forced me then, as I started writing the part 2, because now I'd also processed my own sense of grief, listened through everything. And some of the things that then allowed me to kind of process my grief. So I'll start with my own story, then perhaps you guys can kind of jump in and do your own reflections. My way of processing it was this. First of all, I was numbed. So I write about it. I was numb. I didn't know what to do. So I did what I typically remember to do, which is basically sit with the grief. Because typically what we try and do is that we try and run away from it. We try and distract ourselves with many things. Huh? Like, you know, okay, yeah, Baba's died. And why am I holding this thing so personally, you know? It's not like I knew the guy. It's not like he was a relative, you know? He was a political figure, yes, he had his merits, but why am I feeling it this way? You know, why is it so deep? And that's what I started grappling with. Luckily for me, I'm an artist. So what I did is I started looking for music. And interestingly enough, Baba has there's an incredible playlist of Raila songs, you know, from, you know, Lady Maureen, you know, Prince Inda, even before the new ones that came through. But then Costa Ojuang drops this song, you know, and that song for me just completely speaks to the moment, completely speaks to the moment. It really, you know, like, you know, here's a refrain that says, Chalgingero, Thoginga Chalgingero, which means this death is like a joke. It's like it's not real. It's like somebody's, I don't know, it's like somebody's playing with my mind. Like, what do you mean the guy is gone, you know? And it's beautiful when you kind of say it in Luo, in Doluo, because it's a kind of, you know, you're using humor to describe the indescribable, like a describable feel, like, I can't believe it, like I can't believe it. You know it has happened, you can see his body lying there in state, but it's taking you a long time to process, all right? And then he says, you know, Lo Jachien, you know, like this, the soil, the earth, it's a wizard, you know, it's this thing, you know, that takes the people that we love. And you know, and so the only thing you can do is then basically dance, and that's the way you kind of process your grief. So that's pretty much how I responded to it. So I did what I did do it as an artist, as in I sat with the grief, I surrounded myself with good art that spoke to the moment, and then I started writing, you know, and it took me a long time to write. I think this is one of the hardest pieces I've had to write, at least this year, outside of my book project. But you should check it out. It's on my website, but it's also on Substack. So it's Baba's Gone, The Missing Chapter, Part 2. Now the idea about the missing chapter is a kind of inspiration from, I don't know if you guys remember Binyavanga Wanaina, you know? So Binyavanga basically, when he had done his books, I think the title of his book was Coming Home. And then after that, what he did is that he said there was a missing chapter. When he came out of the closet and revealed, dear mom, and I'm a homosexual. So I'm using that essence, you know, like the missing chapter, to basically speak to this moment. And what I did with the story, what I tried to do with the story was something quite interesting. I took basically the same story, because what is kind of a transposition. Huh? So I took the essence of the same story in terms of the rhythm of the same story, my original Baba is gone, and then I transposed to Baba, the universal figure, which is basically Raila Odinga. And I tried to write it largely inspired by, and George, thank you for sharing that, largely inspired by Costa, but also within the Sigweya tradition, you know, the Dutch tradition amongst the Luo. You might have seen a couple of old men, you know, I haven't brought up a flyweight today. Not those guys who are in Nini. Not those guys who are in, there's some jokers we usually see around. I want to name names because I'm not that kind of guy. But not those kind of Joey types. No, I'm talking about like, you saw a guy called Ajiki Kodiamo. You know, the people who do like a proper dodge, you know, like, you know, which is basically, you know, like a funeral rite. So I was trying to write it basically in the form of a dodge, you know, in a way that basically it's a way of remembering, you know. And so basically it's basically the permission to mourn, because this is the one thing we don't do enough as Yehudis. We've kind of forgotten how to mourn. Yeah, we do the whole year RIP, rest in peace, you know. Then we go back into the Mchango game, which is basically M-Pesa, what's up, you know, support. But in terms of just sitting with the grief, sitting with the loneliness, sitting with the absence, that we don't do enough, you know. So this is what I want to speak to. I'm glad to see some really distinguished guests here. Moses Aburu, Karibu, Andrew K, I saw you there, Karibu, Oluwach Madiang, who is the host of the host, Karibu Sana. So will you include it in an updated edition of Strength and Sorrow? That's a good question. What I'd like to do, and this is really inspired by Benya, because Benya had the missing chapter, is that when I finally, and I think there's enough kind of response to it, if there's an updated version of Strength and Sorrow, I really have to write the Raila chapter, because it kind of just, he sits perfectly for me. Because one thing, Raila, for those of us, and I try and speak to this, he represents a lot of things, you know? So there's, and we kind of learned how to separate the two. So there's Raila, you know, the phenomena, you know? Right Honorable, you know? Aguambo, phenomena. Tinga, the fourth, you know what I mean? What's the other name, yeah? So there's all of that. And then there's Baba, of course, the statesman. But for a lot of us, the people we really knew, this is why I kind of make the distinction, was Amolo, you know? Because Amolo was just this guy, you know? I mean, he's our fathers, you know, he's our uncles. He's a very familiar guy. He's Amolo, you know what I mean? He's a guy, and he's interesting because Raila, or what we like to call Amolo, he had a very strange persona in the sense that he was everywhere. So he was always, you know, like in like public events, you know, like, so I met him in a lot of funerals and a lot of kind of and I write about like 2 encounters where I just bumped into the guy. And what always surprised me about him was that how human he was. He was just, I don't know, anybody, I mean, people can speak to their own encounters, but he's just a guy. You know, there's no, you know, like you think that was special charisma, you know. I mean, when he's on stage, it's something else. You know, he's on stage, oh, that's something else. But you bump into this guy, like, as I bumped into in the UKC, he's working his way to the bathroom. I literally just stopped him, and we just really had a chat. Normal. When I bumped into him at my cousin's place in Shags, a month after that humiliating loss in 2022, normal, regular guy, having his whiskey, yakking, knows everybody, he's an incredible memory. So I was trying to speak to his humanity, because I think that was getting lost in the conversation, you know? And so I would love to kind of answer Oluwachi's question, is that I'd love to kind of expand it really beautifully, you know, to add more nuance to it, you know, kind of in the revised edition. Perhaps, you know, maybe next year, we'll see how that works out. But yeah, but it'll be beautiful for Molo to, you know, to sit, because now this Baba's Gone chapter of mine takes on a completely new meaning. You've got a comment here from Kwame Nkrumah. Nice to see you, NK. You're quite inspirational growing up while in boarding school back in the day. Bring back the column. Bring back that column. I wish I could, bro. I wish I could, you know. But I'm so grown now. I'm writing about other things, but please just check out what I'm writing. Are you able to have this? I do this regularly, by the way. I do this live like every Thursday, and I'm trying to kind of put them up on YouTube. If you go to kind of my Facebook page, you'll find a whole series of them. No? So I'm trying to keep it regular. George Ponte is asking me, I was wondering who will give Raila befitting traditional salute. He used to do it for so many people. That's the thing also, you know, like, if you've ever been to, and of course, you know, I've got the privilege of just regionalism, I suppose, because Raila was quite involved in the larger kind of, I guess, Luo community. And so he's a man we saw quite regularly at a lot of funerals. And you always wanted to wait. And I remember, like, I can remember two funerals. Maybe people like Oburu could speak to it more. But I remember two funerals where the guy goes on stage. First of all, Ryder comes into a funeral, he disrupts it, huh? Because first of all, he never comes on time. Because now that you get it, he's Raila. He's doing so many things, huh? But he still has to make time to come for a funeral to bury people. So the guy eventually shows up, and when he shows up, of course, he shows up with the whole world, and everybody in that place, all the young men turned into bodyguards, and so he's escorted, and by the time things settle down, and he always comes with an entourage, so the Nyongos are there, the Orengos, there's always an entourage of guys, huh? And then when he gets a chance to speak, it was very interesting. These two times I listened to him, he always gave history lessons. I remember this one, we're burying an uncle of mine in Rusinga. And it starts with Josuba. Who are they? Where do they come from? What is their story? And it goes into this trajectory of basically tracking the history of the Basuba right back from, how they basically came into Kenya. I had the guy say that in the same thing at what would be like my mother's home, which is called Seme. And he said, Josemege, these people from Seme, who are they? Where did they come from? And he goes into a whole historical lesson talking about basically our lineage. So the guy, in a way, I also found him quite interesting as a historian. For a lot of us who then saw his other sides outside of his political mystique, because his political mystique was so big. But what we really enjoyed was about the human, what you call a molo, and the things that he shared. And one of those things that we really liked, and George makes that point, is he had this ability, in a way, he had a kind of a totality, right? He could be deeply rooted in culture, but at the same time, he's a very liberal guy. Like if you track, for example, how he speaks about women, how he treats his daughter, how he treats his wife, it could be like really liberal, like really modern, He's a guy who's basically singing back Harry Belafonte. But at the same time, he could be deeply rooted in culture, So I'd never had this guy called Ajike Kodiamo. The elder we might have seen during the ceremony, twice in Kisumu and later on in the final rites on Sunday, who then, if you remember the part, Winnie Odinga calls over an old man, and he comes with this fly whisk, and he goes on this kind of what sounds like a chant, but ultimately is a dirge. Now, I've listened to many dirges over the years, many, but this one resonated in a way, and I guess people from my part of the world can witness. That thing hit us deep, like it's to goosebumps, And here we're watching it, so I can imagine how it was for people who are live. I'm watching it via a screen, but it was like goosebumps. And so, of course, I was like curious to find out, who the hell is this guy? And then, of course, I track back into, as a good journal should, I track back into, I guess Facebook, rather not Facebook, YouTube, it's like kind of like a library now. And I find an old video of Raila basically launching the book of this man, called a JK, written with some guy called Jotham Otun. And in it is basically, it's called Echoes of Mourners. And Raila then gives some small speech, unfortunately it's in Doluo, about the importance of documenting the Sigwaya, the tradition of the Luo Dages, you know what I mean? And so that's the kind of guy he was, that's the complexity of he was. That's what I try to speak to in this piece, because a lot of people then we get stuck with just Agwambo, the political phenomena, which has its place. There's people who can discuss that, but I was really speaking to his humanity, and I think that's what is really affecting people from a point of grief, because if you think about it, this particular gentleman has been with us for literally 50 years. Like Raila has basically been active for 50 years, for a different generation. I came to know him in the 80s because I started hearing about this son of Odinga who was detained, supposedly detained by Moi to punish Jaramogi. So it was almost mythological. I remember this is the era where Nelson Mandela was also detained. So we're growing up in an era where there's a lot of political prisoners around the world, at least famous political ones. So Nelson Mandela has been the mascot of, of prisoners of consciousness. But then we had Raila. And then it's not the kind of, I don't know, no disrespect, the kind of detention where you're kind of just sitting in Kapenguria. This is like proper torture. The man is being tortured. They're trying to break him. And so then he comes out of this detention, and we don't quite know this guy, and we watch him over the years rise, rise first of all, he's not exactly on good terms with his father, then rise from the shadow of his father, become his own man, and become this political figure, and then grow into this person that he becomes. You remember the Kibaki torture moment, and it keeps evolving and evolving and evolving. But the thing that he doesn't lose, is his humanity. That's the weirdest thing about him that I found quite different from the other class of politicians. And I've seen quite a few, So this is what I try and speak to, and this is what I suspect, just from kind of my anthropological eye, that is really was Raila's appeal, which is why I think his particular funeral, the news of his death has affected people in this way. Okay, I've been doing a lot of talking. So if you have any comments, this is how it works. For those who are just joining us now, typically I'm trying to kind of do a broad discussion on this phenomena of Baba. I have written to some degree about how I found myself grieving him. I believe we're still going to be grieving him for a long time, because if anybody then understands the process of grieving, what typically happens, especially when a kind of a central figure, and the reason I use Baba in particular, because there's a kind of mirroring. Anybody who has lost a father, or even, let's say, a mother, basically, a central figure, like a pillar in a family, what typically happens is you're hit with that shock the first time, and then you're kind of surrounded during the frenzy of a funeral. So you're busy, you're all busy. There's a kind of adrenaline rush, You have to get it right, you have to honor the wishes of the deceased. You have to do it correctly. And then what happens is that the funeral ends, the person is under the ground, usually typically sealed with cement, and everything quiets down. And the funny thing is, for everybody else, life moves on. And that's when you start to really get a sense of the absence, of like, oh, this person is never coming back. And I think Winnie, the youngest daughter, said it, The thing is that, I think, was it Winnie or I think it was Ada who said it during her eulogy, that wherever you went, you always knew he was coming back. But for the first time, even when he was in detention, they always believed he was coming back. They always kept that hope alive. But for the first time, they're like unsure. Is this guy going to be coming back? And so that's what happened. So this is the season really we're entering. We're grappling with the magnitude of the loss and the many facets that this phenomena, this of a human being called Raila Odinga, represented for us. So that's what I'm trying to basically grapple with. I've given you some of my own reflections. I'd be very happy if you could kind of throw in your own reflections, or perhaps ask me some questions that could help me trigger a further discussion. I just want to welcome some guys who have just come in. Jeptab, Sakome, Karibu Sana, good to see you. Moses Oburu, I thought I said hello. It's always good to see you here. And George and Apollo, Karibuni Sana. So, yeah, so this is the phenomena, because one of the things that the Baba moment has forced us to do is to basically grapple with grief. And you can see, for example, the reactions, like there was a governor who I refused to, what did Washira used to say? I wouldn't even give him the honor I wouldn't dignify him by even naming him, who said then something, who says something quite alarmist. And you can see the outpouring, the rage that follows that statement. There's a kind of rawness now. Well, a statement like that would have been completely dismissed, There's a kind of rawness now, that's happening. And so we're in a season of grief, but it's at a national level, it's at a scale that's quite large. So So this is what we're grappling with, and this is what I'm interested in hearing, in terms of hearing your own reflections, and in terms of like, how you seeing it from your end of the spectrum, you know, like what are you seeing? What did this moment do to you? How did you respond to it? Omondi is here, Omondi Okelo, Omondi. Omondi tells me that I remember Baba coming to my uncle's funeral, Kisumu and Bondo. The guy was Dave Okwach. Oh, Dave Okwach is quite famous, ODM guy, chairman Kisumu. He basically funded the whole thing. What a man, I'm so saddened. That's the thing about, and I make this point in the article, is that, I mean, that's why this guy is a grandpa for us, you know, that's why I like to think of him as Amolo. He's familiar, you know, and it's a quality that I kind of grew up around and I kind of know, and a quality that I try and kind of also emulate. He had this ability to just basically to stay connected. You know, so he was everywhere. And I remember growing up, you know, watching my old man, my dad, who I lost while I was quite young, is that they always seem to be attending funerals. You know, it's like literally every other weekend they were going somewhere. And at every funeral they would go to, and especially when they started accompanying them, is that they would always be reconnecting a family tree. You know, this is your relative from this and this and this. This is your relative from this and this and this and this. And so when we were the last of the generation that really that understood the extended family in its totality. So like, for example, I knew who my mother's cousins were, you know, so like in its totality, you know, like that's how big the extended family used to be. These days, we barely know our own, literally, first cousins, barely. And we're kind of very nuclear, you know. But while I kind of defied that, you know, he kept always speaking to the larger family, which is why he felt so, everybody kind of owned him. You know, you'd meet the guy and it felt like he knows me because, first of all, he just had this incredible ability to, I guess, recall. You know, I'm told, and from those who knew him a little bit personally, was that he just didn't forget a thing. Like, he had an amazing recall, and I think he was just kind of a lover of history. So he had an ability to kind of connect all of these connections, which is why, for example, when I met him at that incident in the United Kenya Club in Nairobi, I was telling him about the loss of my cousin. I had a cousin called Adiambo, who had passed on. And I'd heard from stories from my folks and older people that my auntie, who had also passed on, who was called Flora Radwodi, Nyadwe, was, they used to be quite close to the while they were growing up, you know, like kind of like, you know, we talk about like the late 50s, early 60s in Nairobi, the Ziwani crew, because my folks also grew up in Ziwa, you know, and Akina Raila used to be there. So they were kind of like part of a fraternity. So when I was told that the guy actually knew, so I just kind of said it as a kind of a courtesy thing, you know, like, you know, you meet an older person and courtesy is just like, hey, by the way, we had a loss in our family. I thought you should know. And it's amazing, you know, the moment I told him that, the man just started just basically breaking down my family tree for me, you know. And that's why that moment always stayed with me. You know, it was hardly 10 minutes, you know. But he had an ability to connect with you so completely that you just thought, oh, shit, he sees me, you know. And that's like kind of what made him kind of exceptional. His ability just to kind of sit in his humanity. Japta tells me that the moment also made me numb. I haven't mourned him. I couldn't type rest in peace for Baba. The songs by Maureen helped a lot. I wish I was home in Kenya. I think this is kind of the feeling of a lot of people in the diaspora, you know, which is why then God bless the artists, man. Man, support the arts. Because, I mean, if there was ever a time when you needed artists, it was one of these times, you know. And for those of us who at least have the benefit of language, but you know, music is universal, there's a whole, you know, I mean, there's a whole kind of playlist of Raila songs that I never even listened to. I'd had them like, you know, over the years, you know. People like Musa Juma, who we like to call MJ. There's a lady called Lady Maureen, who had done a song, you know, during the day. You know that the famous time when they were like, Bye Bye While You're Away, you know, around that time, she had done a song. All of these songs now became companions, you know, and I kind of surrounded myself with music. And I believe a lot of people are doing the same. Because music has a way of just kind of, and you think about it, even those of you who have been, at least those of you from Western Kenya, who understand kind of the traditional funeral rituals. One of the things we do, the reason why in a wake there's always music, is music carries you along, It's a great companion for sorrow. I mean, if people are just kind of seated, and we like to say in Dolo, gimech, just kind of sitting in your misery and coldness, it becomes kind of difficult. But where there's music, music carries you along because it allows for kind of a communal mourning, a collectiveness, So I found amazingly that there was a lot of art to help us carry through this moment. I suspect, especially for those of us who don't have the benefit of the community of home, that through the music we're always able to connect, So this is what I So just to speak to your point, Jeptab, sorry for mispronouncing that, Jeptab. That was exactly what was happening. Muzalendo Mtemu wa Kiama, karibu sana. That's a proper revolutionary right there. Yeah, karibu sana. So if you just kind of joined us, I'm speaking to Baba's legacy, like how we all responded to his loss, when the news came on the 15th, where were you? How did it hit you? How did it affect you? I can tell you, even as somebody who has been writing about grief for a long time, even as somebody who perhaps might have been preparing for this very moment, I was still numbed. I went numb, like I didn't know what to say, and that's why I thank God for Costa Ojuang and all those other musicians who produced art, I mean, Fali Ipupa, even Fali Ipupa also put out something out there. I think I listened to something from Diamond. So it's amazing how the artists have a sense of occasion. They know how to respond, Muzalendo, and he's been following politics for a long time, tells me that I've never mourned a Kenyan politician. I've teared up several times every time I remember Baba, and that he will never speak again. It's still surreal for me. And I think, that's, thank you, Mtemi, for just sharing that. And I think this is the sentiment that a lot of people will have, I mean, at least those of us brave enough to just admit that, man, this loss is profound. This loss is profound. And it's going to take us a while to realize just how much cover this particular individual was giving us. I was speaking to a friend of mine earlier today, and we're just kind of reflecting on this moment. And I think he occupied, and that's why I think of him as a kind of a father parental figure. Like he occupied such a big space that people didn't need to do nothing. Like hence the reason we used to say, and we made the joke of, you didn't even need to read the Constitution. You'd say, oh, Baba Mesoma, watch a Baba Some. That kind of father figure who's covered you for so long, you kind of forget the privilege of the shadow that you're operating under. So I suspect now, in his absence, is when to some degree, his greatness will become really apparent, and this is kind of what I'm trying to reflect on. And perhaps my job then as an artist is to wake people up to this reality that, hey, we need to kind of reflect deeply on how we're processing our own grief and to understand that sometimes the universal is also the personal, So it can be confusing sometimes, and people are trying to process this, is that, how is it that I'm so affected by somebody I didn't really know? And it happens to all of us in different degrees, You've seen that with like famous musicians, Weeks before, I had a whole retinue of people who were speaking about, if you know the musician called D'Angelo, who I hadn't listened to probably since my college days. And I had a whole bunch of cousins telling me about how the D'Angelo loss made them feel. So these connections, people feel them. People have the same things towards actors. I can tell you for a fact, if Denzel died right now, people would mourn him in Kenya. So this thing happens. But then you have somebody like Raila, who's very present, who's very around us, who's completely human, who's completely complex, a mix of contradictions, but somebody who's able to live with these contradictions and contain them without splitting, that's a big loss. And it's going to affect us. Okay, I want some reflections. I want to hear from guys. Yeah? What you think, what you'd like me to speak to in regard to this. If you've read any of the pieces I put out for in reflection, my tributes to Baba, you can also speak to it. But generally, I want to hear what you have to say about how this loss affected you, where it found you, what your response is, and and how moving forward, how do you speak to this loss? As I'm waiting for some of those comments and those reflections, again, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and he spoke to the issue of kids, like his kids. He said like his kids were all sitting watching, and he had kids like who were about what do you call it? God, whatever. Like kids like preteen, just 10 going on to 12, and they were fascinated by what was happening. And it reminded me, back in the day when Jaramogi first died, Jaramogi Odinga, Raila's father. And there was something called, and I don't know if there's a translation, but it's called, let me just use the Luo word first and I'll try and translate it, Onwengo, which is basically, it's like the weather becomes misty. It becomes misty. And of course, the interpretation of the time then was that, the earth is crying with him. But it was the first time, and I was in the village the other day, in the time, in a place in Siaya, and there was just, in the wake to his burial, there was just this sense of pensiveness and depression and what you like to call kuyo, sadness, and this has happened again. So there's a sense of it, So I want people to speak to this. I've got a comment from Rolex Opondo. Rolex had the privilege of meeting Rolex in Nairobi. Interesting, Rolex. I would like to hear your reflections on the Baba chapter. Baba's gone, because Rolex got me to sign his Baba chapter because he happened to be his dad's second year death anniversary. So many things have happened since. But Rolex tells me, I want to share with you a playlist, a link I did on Saturday in his honor with 10 songs. Unfortunately, most of the artists are now deceased. And Rolex has put it here. It's on, so you'll be able to see it on my page. There's a whole playlist of kind of Raila songs. Man, music makes a hell lot of a difference. So if you're going through your own kind of sense of like grief, trying to make sense of it, trust me, just use music, man. Go to use music. It's a beautiful companion. It's great for reflecting. Thank you, Rolex, man. So guys, just check out the comments. You'll see. Rolex has given us a YouTube page there. Jeptab tells me again, how do I get the book in Belgium? Please share the information. I'll try and do that. If you go to my website, actually, if you do send an email to info@oyungapala.com, info@oyungapala.com, and send me your details and see if I can get it to you, because I have a distributor out of Netherlands. That might be possible. Danish, always good to see you here. Danish says, the 72-hour burial requirement in the will most likely played a role in the shock. People like Raila should have been mourned for a while before they were buried, but understand the need to bury him fast as the enigma. There's been a discussion around this, like typically, for those of us from Western Kenya, typically, it was always like this, by the way. It's interesting the way tradition changes, but typically, we usually have, let's just say a two week, usually 1 week to 2 week mourning period. Especially if it's an elder person like this, it tends to be longer. Why? Because it takes time to organize people, It takes time to organize people. It also gives people an opportunity, because it's somebody who has a very wide network. It gives people an opportunity to show up, So the relatives from the different branches of the family can gather and come and pay their last respects. Now, it's interesting. So I had 2 conversations around this. And Danish, thank you for kind of prompting this. 2 conversations around this. The first was that, obviously, given the phenomena that is Raila, the enigma, is that if you had kept a very long period, and this, I think perhaps this is the wisdom of the man, very long period, there would have been a lot of tension, even given some of the remarks we're hearing now and how people are responding to them, there would have been a lot of tension, You know, you remember how the first reaction was, how the police reacted at Kasarani to what was, I guess, episodes of unruly grief. You know, trigger happy. You know, a kind of rungu policing. You know, people getting shot at, all of that stuff. There's a kind of panic. So there's a tendency, there's a likelihood that it could have been quite chaotic. You know, and then of course from in terms of the political ramifications would have been quite big. So I think Baba in his wisdom knew that, the quicker the better, it will save things. The interesting thing is like what this then does for a lot of, and especially those from Western Kenya. Because if you remember, it ties down to, remember the COVID burials? And the COVID burials then were happening like really quick. Somebody dies and within 48 hours they've been buried, And I've had conversations also happening that saying perhaps then Raila has set a precedent, especially for those men who will leave their wills. And perhaps we might start seeing a kind of change of tradition because, trust me, do not underestimate the influence of somebody like Raila, like Baba. So you might see a change of tradition where people then start opting for quicker funerals in order to kind of perhaps reduce the stress of a funeral that imposes on a family. So we might see a change of tradition, as tradition is always constantly dynamically changing. I can tell you as a matter of information that in my dad's day, in the 50s and the 60s, people were buried quite quickly. There was no this prolonged, because there was no kind of the death industry. So there were no like proper modern morgues that helped with the preservation of bodies. So bodies couldn't last for a very long time. So as soon as somebody died, it was in the best interest to bury them as quickly as possible. But then as people started getting dispersed, the family living, especially with urbanization, what was then the rural-urban migration, where a whole generation moved into the city, what would then happen is that when somebody died, there would be a necessity to transport them back. And in order to transport them back, we had to organize ourselves. We were people who were working. We had to get leaves. And slowly by slowly, the tradition changed. And what we now see as a 2-week mourning period was ultimately something that has changed over time. So there's the possibility that we could see it reverting to a much shorter period based on the example that Raila has basically put forth. Tabu has a question, has a comment for me. Tabu says that I feel that it will be a delayed realization in the months to come, especially for his family. Right now, we are all dazed. That's kind of true, like we're really in a daze in a way, because I can tell you for a fact, anybody who was buried properly, anybody who has been in a state of, who's been in the funeral process, the shock hits you after the event, after the event. That's when the real mourning process starts, and which is why I try and have these conversations for people to realize that grief is not something you turn off. It's not like you turn it off and say, oh, to Mombeleza, and that was it, and it's done, rest in peace, thank you so much, we loved you, let's move on. No, it doesn't work that way. If you truly connected with somebody, it comes back in waves. It's a series of waves. Which is why it's always important to kind of surround yourself in a collective, and sometimes you allow yourself to kind of sit in it. So to some degree, I agree with what Tabu is saying. That a lot of people are still dazed. And it will take some time to process. And what I'm finding also with the Baba moment is that Baba is forcing us to reflect on our own losses. Because I've had conversations with a number of people who say, I'm reminded of when my father died. I'm reminded of when my mother died, It's people are remembering. It's like the body has its reasons, and the body is like a memory system. So one thing happens and it triggers another. And then there are those, for example, with aging parents who are now forced to reflect on that possibility, on that reality. Like, how will I respond if it happens to me? Remember, you can put in your questions there, you can put in your comments, and I'll try and get to them. Moses is telling me that my love for Baba was always for real. I found myself shedding tears when Winnie shared his passionate tribute, shared her passionate tribute for Jacom. Yeah, and Yeah, I know. I can imagine. You know, and I think I listened to a lot of the tributes. I think Winnie had a phenomenal tribute for her dad. I was particularly moved by when she called this Ajeke Kotiamo, you know, to give the Siguaya. You know, it's a very kind of special moment. You know, I'll give you a variation of it, by the way. You see, for example, typically within I guess, our hybridation, within a Luo funeral, what typically happens is that it's like there's two worlds playing side by side, you know? So there's the overt Christian world, you know, which is Christian rituals, but then there's a kind of traditional rituals playing side by side. And one of the things that I've seen, so it's interesting to see the opposite variation. One of the typical things that I've seen is like somebody goes up to a stage to speak, to give their testimony, to give their eulogy, and then they become overwhelmed. And what typically happens is there's typically a choir at a funeral that starts to hum and starts to sing in order to kind of ground you. It was interesting what Winnie did. You know, Winnie did something that was really essentially cultural. She called a guy to sing a dirge, and that's kind of what then gave her the confidence to continue speaking. So that I found was really powerful because she was very rooted in culture in a way that I didn't realize she was. Nyakwarokelo Nyalala tells me, Oyunga, share where we can get a sign. Oh man, Nyakwa, I was in like Nairobi for like 2 weeks, zungukaring the whole city. I've got to find a way to kind of see if I can find a way to do some signed copies, you know. But unfortunately, for now, it won't be possible because I did the rounds and I had to, and unfortunately, I'm not around now. So, but we'll try and find a way to do it for you. There's always a way. Okay, so Francisco is here. Always good to see you. And he says, he actually knows my other name. Thanks, Japon, for your timely session, interrogating our mourning of the late His Excellency, the Right Honorable Raila Odinga Baba. In the wake of Raila Odinga's passing, how do we culturally and politically navigate the question of succession, particularly when traditional norms may favor a male heir like Raila Jr., yet the most visible vocal figure has been Winnie Odinga? What tensions arise between cultural expectations and the evolving gender dynamics in leadership within such legacies? Wow. Now, that's a question. You know, like it almost feels like I should reach for my notes. Look, I mean, and guys can speak to this as well, but I'll just kind of give it a shot in an attempt. So I think for me, I think there's a separation between the issues, you know. There's succession within kind of a family, you know. So like, for example, you might have seen a kind of a coronation of sorts, you know, a passing of the leadership where Raila Jr. was now crowned as the kind of male elder of the family, like head of the family, which follows basically because in a patriarchal system, like among the Luo, is basically the first son, irrespective of where he is in the hierarchy, takes up the responsibility. So I saw that kind of handing over. In terms of like succeeding a kind of the political seat, I think for me, I have a different view. Because over the years, we used to ask the question, why doesn't Baba have a succession plan? And if you really understand how that dynamic works, is that you can't kind of, it's not like it's royalty, you know. I mean, yeah, you could do. I know there's some versions of it, and especially given like what we are seeing with like Kenyatta and Uhuru Kenyatta, and perhaps, you know, the Moi and Gideon Moi, and which has kind of become kind of a trend, you know. The Mudavadis, you know, Moses Mudavadi, Musalia, you know, it's kind of like a trend, you know. And that's how we've always thought of it. But I think we shouldn't reduce Baba to kind of, I suppose, what people like to think of as a Luo kingpin, yeah? Because I think he had transcended those labels. If you, and I was reading a post by a guy called Cyprian, who said, you know, he was like the Ayatollah of Kenyan politics. He had transcended that. I mean, he was a man that he didn't even need to be elected president to negotiate with presidents. He had transcended that. So to assume that like somebody within the family can inherit his kind of position purely just because of a blood link it will be a bit difficult, because he's the circumstances of history and the things that you have to go through a very unique set of circumstances to produce a Raila, and for history to repeat itself in that way, I think will be a hard stretch. Not to say that his children don't have their own destinies at hand. Not to say. But I think in terms of just like the kind of how we think about it in the kind of very royalty succession model of like, okay, Mzee Makufa, who's the next person who's going to kind of like be in charge and inherit his constituency, I don't think it's going to be as smooth as that, right? So within the family setup, yes, they will have that. But in terms of people who rise to the occasion and the people then decide that this is our new leader, that will take time. That will take time. And the person himself, and this is the one contradiction that Raila had, it's like the people chose him. He didn't kind of like impose himself on the people, because of his deeds, the people chose him. So that was the true force behind him. That's why he had this perpetual constituency that made him a force. So it's not enough just to carry a name, you have to have the deeds. And I think this is what's going to happen. So in the wake of his passing, and his children to some degree are still young, if those of you who remember the history correctly, Raila only came into parliament in his 40s. In fact, quite late, about almost 47, when he becomes member of parliament for Kibera, But all through that, he's really an insignificant figure. He's really, in a sense that he's operating within kind of the Odinga Luo's shadow. And it's only after Kibera, when he becomes MP in Langata, that he starts to have then, first of all, this cosmopolitan sense and continues to transcend beyond. So I believe everybody then must basically walk their own path, before they can be able to kind of inherit a constituency that was as significant as Raila. That's just my 2 cents on that. Desmond has some reflections. That's a long one. Let me see if I can read it. So Desmond tells me, Baba's death will take longer in my heart. I broke down several times, especially each time I came across a quote by Martin Luther King Jr., which Baba paraphrased. I have been to the mountaintop. I remember that one there. And I have seen the glory land. I might not get there together with you. I might not get there with you, but together we will get there. I would shout, Joey, Joey, Joey. The child Joey would be there'll be a mumbling as my eyes welled up with tears. Yeah, good job on the book. I can relate so much to the Dana story. No, thank you so much, man. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, Desmond, thank you so much for that, man. Desmond Tutu, that's a powerful name, by the way. Desmond Tutu in itself was somebody we hold in great respect. Thank you so much for that comment. Jared Onyango is telling me, if you'll be able to share the recording of this session, I would really appreciate it. Yeah, it will sit on my Facebook, and then of course, I'm trying to get organized so I can have it on YouTube as well. But at least it will sit on my Facebook, so you'll be able to see it. Tabu has a comment for me. Remember, guys, if you have a comment, you can just kind of throw it in there, and then we'll just kind of, freestyle a bit. But we're basically doing a reflection on Baba. Baba is gone, and what does that mean for us personally, more importantly, more than rather the political space, because, yeah, that's a conversation for another day, but more like personally. What does it mean to you? How did the news of his loss affect you? I've tried to give a little bit of my own reflections. I'm now opening space for others to kind of do the same. So Tabu Olulo tells us, I buried my mom same time in 2020 during the COVID pandemic, and we only had 24 hours. I felt like everything was up in the air. Man, first of all, I just want to say, Pole. I cannot imagine how that felt like. I cannot imagine how that felt like. I cannot imagine. Because those COVID funerals were harsh. They were like a shocker. I mean, you can imagine, God, man, it almost triggers something for me. Because I even have images. And I mean, the people in the, what do you call that, the haz suits, it's like you're dealing with some, I don't know, contaminated body. It was some of the most undignified funerals I've seen in a long time. And as an artist, I wondered, what is this going to do to us? What's this going to do to our memory, you know? That some people were just kind of buried without the ritual of mourning, you know? So I get that, you know, and in some way I'm kind of glad to some degree that despite the fact it was 72 hours, the country was able to kind of just sit still and engage in mourning, you know? And I think that really made a big difference, you know, that we're able to just kind of sit still, watch it out. And since it was such beautiful ritual, in a way, there's a lot of pageantry, of course, but if you think about, there was the ritual of the state, you know, there was the cultural rituals, you know, there were the family rituals, there were the Christian rituals. So this collective of rituals helped us process this loss in different ways, but at least it gave us access, which is why I always say ritual is really important. You know, why do we do these things, you know? Why do we, and I write about this in the book, in the chapter about Baba's Gone. It was me reflecting on the importance of ritual. Why is it that when somebody dies, we go to that house, we sit there, you know? Why do we collect money? You know, why do all of these collective things, they serve a purpose. So it's very important, especially for those of us who are in positions of leadership, in a way, within a family system. You know, you're a parent, you're an uncle, you're somebody who people rely on for a decision. It's very important that you understand the importance of rituals so you don't disregard ritual, you know, out of perhaps a frustration or frustrations of experiences, right? So, you know, yes, of course, rituals can be abused, but understand the context of the ritual so that you can use it and understand its importance, right? Rather than just, you know, classically throwing away the baby with the bathwater. Fabian has a comment for me, which I'll get into right now. It's a nice long one. Fabian says, I think speaking about Baba, this man was spiritual and spirit inspired. He has been compared to the other Mandela, but a deeper dive into the man Rao sets him apart. Not just apart, but at a much higher level. He's one man with not just many names, but many meaningful, solid, and sustainable names. Some say that he's a spirit, some say that he will not die. Is it true? A deeper thought actually shows that it is true. He sleeps in death, but he lives on. I believe we'll have content that will keep us busy for a very long time. Odinga's family has demonstrated order in conducting a funeral, burial, and post-burial rites to succession. The government has done well so far, but the question is, are we entering into a different phase of grief? Does the government anticipate this next phase? Are we prepared to walk the long walk with citizens in grief and create systems that will sustain Rao's next phase in our lives, from research, documentation, development of documentaries, movies, and all that will ensure the sustainability of the enigma? Yesterday I told somebody, this is a blog post, my brother. Yesterday I told someone that he enters the league of Luanda Magere, and he asked me whether Luanda Magere was real. I believe in the future the generations that will read about him and wonder whether he was an actual man and that he actually existed. Looking forward to interacting with the next phase of Agwambo. This is a very beautiful reflection by Fabian Darrow. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I can relate completely. You know, it's like, yeah. I mean, he becomes a mythical creature. You know, because his deeds are so his deeds are so expansive and so wide that basically he transcends, you know. And what happens is that it becomes almost impossible to find anybody who can fit in a way in his shoes and walk in that path, that he ends up inspiring generations upon generations and generations. I believe, as you say, we're going to go through a season of deep reflection, especially in the wake of his loss. We'll start to realize the gap that has left behind. And hopefully, and I think his legacy is in solid hands. If the last 1 week has been any testament, if you look at the amount of tributes that have come out, the kind of music that has been done, you know, and especially I'm really paying attention to Kenya's artistic class. Man, that's been, I mean, I'm really happy as I'm kind of older gentleman now, that we have a generation that's awake, we have a generation that has a sense of occasion, you know. And I think his legacy is going to be really handled beautifully. I'm sure in the coming years we'll see a lot of documentaries, we'll see movies, we'll see different books around his legacy, you know. And also, the thing that you mentioned there that I also find is quite nice is that how his family have handled the moment, you know, because they've had to share Raila with all of us. And typically, you know, most families, especially when you have somebody that as big as he was, you know, in a process like this, you try and kind of contain him and keep him to yourself, kind of privatize it, you know. But what I found amazing about the Odingas is that they continue to share, you know. Even as they're doing their family rituals, they continue to share. They give us access to this phenomenon because in a way they understand that he also belonged to all of us. Yeah. So thank you much, Fabian. That was a beautiful reflection. Huh? Still open to a couple of questions. I think we got some time still, probably about 20 minutes or so. Sandra, let me read what Sandra has to say. Sandra says, I can really relate to what has been shared on Baba's loss, prompting a reflection on our own losses and the possibility of losing an aging parent, especially when we are a strong patriarch that positively carries the family forward. Yeah, in a way, that's why I kind of, Sandra, thank you, you know, I kind of used that Baba's Gone. That's why I kind of like worked with that title, because it was the best way for me to kind of make sense of the loss. And I know this loss particularly because he's a reflection of many, you know. Everybody has their variation of a Baba in their lives, you know. So, you know, that ideal older citizen, older relative who carries so much and has carried so much for so long, that on the person that you've grown up with from a child into adulthood, and they still continue to occupy this huge space. And then they reach a point where they start to kind of slow down and you start to wonder, how do I prepare for this eventuality? How do I prepare for a loss this big? It's not that people didn't anticipate the passing of Raila, but you're never ready. This is the one thing I say. And in my book, when I write about, there's a chapter here I write about in one of my meditations. Let me see if I can recall it. I write about Martin Shikuku. It's one of my meditations. It's called Digging Your Own Grave, 147. And in this book, that's the book I'm talking about, by the way. And yeah, so I'm reflecting. So Martin Shikuku was a Kenyan politician and is famous, known as the People's Watchman, but he's famous because he dug his own grave. You know, like he prepared everything. He dug his own grave, you know, like put the preparations in place, including the bulls that would be slaughtered at his funeral. And of course, he didn't die for another 8 years before he finally succumbed and he was buried. And I remember when I was doing the research for this story, I ran into kind of a YouTube clip and where his wife was speaking. And she said, and you see, he had dug more than one grave for himself and also for his wife. And she said, even when you're prepared, even when you've been prepared by somebody like as deliberate as Martin Shikuku, the death still hits you. It still hits you. Even when you're prepared, even when you've been set up, you're like, okay, it's coming. It still hits you. And that's why we need to kind of have this conversation. We need to reflect, because this is the processes of life, you know. This are realities of life. And especially as we grow older in positions of responsibility and leadership, caring for younger people, we need to be able to kind of walk them through these realities of life, you know. So we don't kind of shield, especially young children, from this phenomena, because it is life, you know. Which is why we say, and if we're to learn anything from people like Raila, is that they learned how to die empty. And if there's one thing we can say about Baba, is that, man, he gave it all. You know, so even as the rest, we can kind of let him go. Even as much as we want to hold on to him, but we can say, man, he gave it his all to the very last. You know, he was still walking, still trying to get in shape, you know, to come back for another round, you know. So this is why it's important to kind of reflect on the end of life process, because by reflecting on the end of life process, it forces us to reflect on the present. Is how are we living with this gift that we call life? You know, how are we dealing with it? Are we just kind of, you know, juggling it around, not paying attention? Or are we really embracing it as a gift that has a timeline? You know, life does come to an end, my people. So, we've got about 15 more minutes. I'll take a couple of more responses and I'll try and bring this to a close. Tabo is telling me, sometimes political inheritance just falls on your laps. Look at Mutula Jr. His sister was vocal and strong, but he just fell into the role without being groomed by Mutula Sr. Sometimes it's just opportunity that brings the right place and the right time. Yeah, that's a good way. That's a good way to kind of look at it as well. You know, I mean, there is the kind of a succession that typically happens within political families, but ultimately we know that, and this is what then makes Baba's story a little bit different. He was more than a politician, you know, and that thing that it takes to produce a phenomena like Baba is basically, it's just experience. You have to be tried and you have to be tested, you know, in order to then be forged in the kind of mode of this individual that we now mourn and celebrate. Yeah. But Tabu, thank you for that. You know, that's a good reflection as well. Zablon is here. Good to see you, Zab. I went to school with Zab, you know, so amazing for him to join us here. I'm so amazed by how you bring this up. Keep it blazing. Thank you, Zab. Thank you, man. I appreciate that comment, huh? Kwame Nkrumah tells me, NK. I like to call you NK. Kwame Nkrumah tells me, sorry, let me just read this properly. Kindly enlighten us on Fidel Odinga's day whilst Raila was in detention and Fidel was in Beji Academy in Nias. Yeah, I wish I could, you know. I didn't know Fidel personally, but and my cousin Andrew was here earlier. Andrew went to school with Fidel in Beji, and I can tell you, at least from what I've heard, is that Fidel, by the way, just for those who don't know, Fidel Odinga, named after Fidel Castro, was Raila Odinga's oldest son. He died a couple of years ago. I'm not quite sure what year. I probably have to just research on that. But he went to school in a place called Mbeji Academy, which used to be in Siaya. But I can tell you, those years were hard for the Odingas, you know. If you read kind of Raila's book, you know, there's many, the Enigma, Flames of Freedom, at least he makes an account of that in there, of how much stress Mama Ida went through and how dislocated it was for the children, you know, and what it meant to be a son of an Odinga. You know, you're completely hounded, you know, you're seen basically as a pariah, and it was a very difficult time, you know. So I can only imagine. I can't really speak to it because I didn't know him personally, and I didn't go to Mbeji. But I can tell you, the Odinga families, they went through a lot. The early years were hard years. Things only started getting for the Odingas really in the, I guess, just in the late 90s, you know, when now the movement became so much bigger. But in the early days and in the oppressive years of the Moi years, it was hard. And if you are somebody as vocal as Raila, the state went for everything that was close to you, you know. Everything that was close to you was basically Finward. Let's see if I can take a couple of more comments before I go. Zablon has a reflection, and he tells me that as of now, I'm in deep sorrow as I reflect on Baba's demise. I miss my children as much as Baba is gone. My wife left her children, and I don't know where they are. Baba is gone, my children are gone. Zab, man, sorry to hear, man. Really sorry to hear. Really sorry to hear. Just first of all, thank you just for the sharing vulnerability and sharing that with us. I hope, you know, I hope you're surrounded by friends. I think you are, and that the issues, you know, that you're facing resolve in time, you know. But we hold you dear, you know, and we hope that, you know, that there'll be a good outcome. But for now, just thank you just for being vulnerable, for just allowing yourself to be in that space. The lesson here for me has always been this, you know, and especially as men, and I've been saying something that's changing quite beautifully in our society, is men saying that I'm hurting, I'm hurting. It's something that we didn't always know how to do. Typically our thing was stoicism. Kangubu, don't say a thing, jipeleke kwa bar, bigger shot daddy. That's how it is always. That's how it always was, But I'm liking this new this new wave, I suppose, of men just saying, you know what, yeah, man, it's hurting, because it helps to acknowledge it, and it doesn't mean to say that you're any weak or anything of the sort. In fact, that's the illusion. In fact, the true strength is the ability to sit in your sorrow, which is why Baba became a perfect example. Those of you who have watched Baba have actually seen him tear, and they don't make any men stronger than that, But we've seen him, we've seen him in actual anguish and pain, like literally crying, even quite recently, for much bigger things, like for the bigger dream, but also in very personal things, like how he responded during the death of his son, people remember how he was during the illness that affected his eldest daughter, Rosemary, how he was, for those of us who might remember, how he responded to death, some of his close associates like Mbai, who was assassinated. So it's kind of very important to learn how to sit in your sorrow, in your pain, in your loss, in your frustrations. And kind of this is what this book really is about. It's my grappling with loss, deep loss. And the title of the book, as you can say, is, Strength and Sorrow. But if you think about it in the reverse way, it is this, is that when we learn to kind of sit in sorrow, stay with it, what ultimately emerges is the ability to rise in strength, over time. But there's really no way around it. You really have to sit within it and go through it. And my nephew, one of the nephews who was discussing, who had gone through kind of tragedies of a man who had suffered miscarriage as the man. And it gave me a really powerful reflection where he told me that it's not until you have walked through it over a long time and after time that you actually start to have a glimpse of the light at the end of the tunnel and something changes, but you have to walk through it. So Zab, man, we hold you. We hope, we hope it will turn out all right. But just know for now, just know that you're seen, you're felt, and you're loved. So Moses has a comment for me, and he has a reflection as well. And he says, could Raila Odinga's choice to be buried at his father's homestead rather than at Opoda Farm mark a shift in Luo cultural traditions and around burial legacy? I can try and answer it in two ways. Yes and no, right? So there's been a kind of shift that's been happening, at least within kind of the Luo cultural funeral traditions. This idea of cemeteries, private cemeteries within homes, where people, for example, are buried. Families kind of have a sense of a cemetery. I think, this is just me speculating, I think the Raila decision has a lot to do with the phenomenon of who he was, because he's such a big person, So I think he had a sense of history, knowing that his graveside would be something that people came to. So it made sense to be around where the family site is, around where his father is. Huh? This is just me speculating. Now, the other flip side to it, of course, is that given his influence, and his influence goes without saying, is outsized, yes, I think it will affect the kind of choices that we make, So perhaps, and we said it earlier, one is that there'll be the idea that people can be buried much quicker, so this whole idea of waiting for a long time, especially with someone who is an elderly person, because typically it was almost a foregone conclusion. If there's somebody who was elderly, a minimum would be at least 2 weeks before they were buried. But I think with what we have seen with Baba is that might change. And then also, because culture in a way is also fashion, people like to follow trends, is that there might be the idea that let's think of cemeteries, in order then not to have graveyards all over our properties. Because if you think in terms of succession, you think in terms of like the years that come, then you leave your homes to be your homes the way we do it in the urban areas, and then basically have cemeteries, so like more private cemeteries. So I think this might be the trend that we could see going forward. More people deciding to have their version of private cemeteries. Oguk Taya, good to see you, brother. I met Oguk in Nairobi. It's a hard name to forget, man. Oguk Taya. Oguk tells me that I choose to celebrate Rao. He was a mysterious persona, one of a kind for generations. Rao was many things to Kenyans and the world. However, to his family, Rao was a husband, a father, a brother, and a grandfather. And that really struck me, and it got me thinking of the words of Robin Sharma, who says, "Who will cry when I die, man? While a spirit will linger in the lives of generations, there will always be raw elements in what is his spirit everywhere in Kenya." Yeah, that's kind of true. You know, that's kind of I could tick every moment of what you've said there, and this is what I try to speak to also in my tribute to Baba. Because here's the thing, you know, and that's what I found kind of special. There's many things about this gentleman that we can celebrate, but I think for me the thing that really struck me was his humanity. This guy was just, you know, Chua Ida, you know what I mean? He was Ida's husband, and you knew Ida had some influence in his life. And I've heard stories where Ida's pulled him out of a bar, you know, Ida's, you know, kind of stood up in a kind of and as an assertive wife, you know. And you hear how his children speak about him. He was just dad, you know, like especially when you hear Winnie talking about her father. He was Baba, you know. And if you catch the clips of you know, of him watching as Winnie, for example, is speaking, it's just, you know, like a father proud of his last-born daughter, you know. If you look at the kind of the brotherhood thing they had with Oburu, you know, like those guys were like tight. I've seen them once, you know, like at a night out having whiskeys together. And they were just bros, you know, just hanging out, having fun, reminiscing, singing back old songs, you know. And, you know, and then as a grandfather, you see the way he acted with his grandkids, you know. So I guess that's what really made him something really unique. And I think it's the kind of reminder for us, for those of us who perhaps get into positions of privilege, to not lose our humanity, you know. When power comes knocking, you know, when privilege puts us in positions of power, don't lose your humanity, you know. Okay, I'm about to wind it off. Zab, I'll get back to you after the session. I promise to. Yeah. Jim Justice Nyamu, amazing to have you here. Jimbo, you guys, I must introduce you to Jim Justice Nyamu. He's a phenomenal conservationist. He's been working all around the world to raise awareness around the conservation of elephants. You should look out for him. He's done some amazing, phenomenal work, you know. Jim, Karibu Sana, good to see you here. So I'm about to bring this to a close. Hey, I've got Ndiri here. Good to see you, Andrew Ondiek. About to bring this to a close. I just want to say, man, thank you just for, you know, for being here. And just thank you for being here. Today I put on my hat just a kind of like as a tribute to Baba. You know, he's a very fashionable gentleman. And I really enjoyed this session. It was just nice to reflect on it, to reflect on his legacy. I've written about him, so if you feel like reading about it, you can find it on my website and also on my Substack, and I post on my socials. Facebook is kind of like where I live these days. This particular recording will be available on Facebook, and I'm going to try and make it accessible also on YouTube. So if you want to come back to it and kind of go back to the conversations, it'll all be on Facebook for a while. But for now, I want to bring this to a close. Let me do some small self-promo necessary. I've written a book. It's called Strength and Sorrow. It's out in the bookshops in Nairobi. It's going to be available for those of us outside of Kenya quite soon. So just look out for the details. But for now, it's out in Nairobi and Kenya, basically. In Textbook Center, Nuria Bookshop, which has a branch in Nyali. It's in Half Price Books. It's in Gara, Somanami. It's in Kisumu at Lolwe Books as well. Huh? So grab a copy. It really, and I'd say it's a great companion for anybody going through a deep season of grief, you know. So check it out, and when you do, please kindly share your comments. But for now, I really want to sign out. My name is Oyunga Pala. I try and do this every Thursday, so please, you know, rock back in again. Thank you so much for the support. And as I check out, I always wanted to do this. Next to be, I'm an old radio guy, you know. As I check out, let me try and check out with a little bit of Costa or Joang, who I've never met yet. But when I do meet this guy, whew, I owe him a beer. Because his music made a hell lot of a difference for me during this season. Huh? So let me find Costa or Joang. There we go, found him. And checking out. Oh guys, stay well guys. It's been really good, huh? Stay well. And to Baba, rest in peace, Jacob. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for the gift of your presence. Good night, huh?